So today I'm going to talk about the first portion of my thesis work, the impacts of Asian longhorn beetle and associated eradication efforts on the current composition of forests. This work is done alongside my advisor, Tony D'Amato, as well as Kevin Dodds, one of my collaborators from the Forest Service. So I'll lay out the groundwork for Asian longhorn beetle and Worcester, Massachusetts, one of my study sites, before moving into how this was studied and some preliminary results, and then comparing it with one of our case studies in Claremont County, Ohio. So Asian longhorn beetle is an invasive insect. It is native to China and Japan. It is a wood-boring insect and of the Cerambycid family. It attacks several different species, all hardwoods. Ones of great interest to us New Englanders are red maple, sugar maple, Norway maple, which is often planted in urban areas, as well as several species of birch. It slowly weakens a tree over time by tunneling just below the bark and laying its eggs, and the eggs travel within the tree, and as the eggs move out and form into larvae, and as full beetles, tree death begins. So this process occurs over the life cycle of the insect, and over about like a season or two for us. So Asian longhorn beetle came into Worcester, Massachusetts in 2008. Managers think it could have been there a little bit earlier, as that emergence is when we finally realize the tree is dead and we have a big issue. It came in via wood packing materials through trading ports. So it started in the heart of Worcester, which is this urban area here, and was soon found in other suburban and natural areas outside of the city streets. And this map indicates the quarantine in the gray outline, which is 112 square miles. And the red indicates some full host cuts where all of those host species were removed. It's a 2013, there was much more sites added. It's an ongoing management plan, but over the course of 10 years, 33,000 trees were removed. And what makes Worcester really interesting in the scope of Asian longhorn beetle is the beetle moved beyond these city streets and into natural areas. So ALB had been found in Toronto, Brooklyn, and Chicago before this, and this was the first time it was found in places like this. And so that transition between urban and natural makes it a unique successional pathway to study. What will the presence of invasive species be after management, as well as are host species regenerating when we're removing those trees in mass quantities? Additionally, the proximity of Worcester to the rest of New England threatened that hardwood belt, those maples we know and love, and there's a great interest in further documentation and what this invasive management will look like over time for these forests. Which brings me to my first two study questions, which are: what are the effects of management for ALB 5 to 8 years post-eradication on vegetative structure? And then is there a relationship between treatment type or forest type on the presence of invasive species? And to assess this, we use standard forest health monitoring protocols, ground up, measuring herbaceous vegetation, saplings, overstory trees, and coarse woody materials. We sampled across 4 forest types, as well as 3 treatment types. So the treatment types were the full host first, which is where all host species are removed from saplings, all the way up. And again, to reiterate, those are maples, birch, etc. The herbicide treatment was where the host species are all removed, and then we apply an herbicide to the stumps. And stumps ground is host species removed, and then stumps ground on site. And these were applied in about equal proportion throughout the county. So my diameter distributions from the sites, again, this is after all the maples removed. We see the majority of the trees in the smaller size classes. They're dominated by white oak and red oak and white pine, as expected, as we sampled a lot of white pine hardwood forests, a lot of oak pine, etc. We have some other species indicated by that grayish, some of our token fun species. As a reminder, it's in an urban area, so there was also some planting in some parks and so forth. When we're looking at what saplings and seedlings are returning, we found that red maple is the most dense or most abundant species returning, with white pine following shortly after. And when breaking it down between seedlings and saplings, about a quarter of host species, again those maples, are returning, and about 17% of saplings are red maple and sugar maple and so forth. That remains true across treatment type, with red maple being the most abundant. If we're looking at host species, full host had about a little under 50% of host species returning. And we're looking at our lowest lowest amount coming back. There's a 34% decrease between full host and stumps ground. And while when running some generalized linear models, there wasn't significant results between those density in forest type or density in treatment type, it's worth considering, in particular with this variation across forest type, where oak pine and we didn't count any host species, while white pine hardwood, 3/4 of the species returning were saplings. Were the red maple saplings. We also noted that stump spreading occurred in about 60% of sites. Invasive species returned in small proportions, and again, no significant results in those models. However, there is a change between our full host and stumps ground treatment, with stump ground having no invasive species counted. Similar, oak pine did not return any invasive species, and there was some variation between those different forest types. Now I want to briefly move into Ohio, which is the most recent infestation for Asian longhorn beetle, and there's similarities to Worcester, as ALB was found in an urban area, proximity to this beautiful state park. Given the proximity, they moved the quarantine to include East Fork. It had a lot of maple in it, as well as other host species of concern in the area, such as box elder and buckeye and so forth. We wanted to assess, is there a similar successional pathway? So we only had 2 sites for a number of fun reasons, but they were both red maple floodplains, and they both had an herbicide and chipping treatment in addition to that full host. And while this is observational data, as we have 2 sites, it's worth considering in the grand scheme of ALB management. And comparing herbicide sites, there was a 91% increase between invasives found in Worcester to Ohio. And again, when we're looking in between our 2014 treatment versus 2017, again, it's the same treatment. However, you see about half the species returning in 2014 are invasive, and then about a third in the 2017 sites. And I really like this picture of my tech, as it shows how overgrown it was, and that's after cutting a lot of it back. We saw a lot of the same invasive species, but also some unique ones to the area. So in conclusion, Asian longhorn beetle has been eradicated from several different locations, with Brooklyn being officially declared ALB free last week, which is pretty cool. So we can be confident that ALB eradication works pretty well so far. But it's worth considering future forest goals, in particular when we're seeing ALB move into natural areas. What will the results look like? And as we continue to treat, I think it's worth considering, is our goal to decrease the invasive species coming back, or think about host species? Are we just going to have a tinderbox of all these red maples and sugar keep returning if ALB comes back? We're still only checking about 1% of wood packing materials coming into the United States, despite all the influx of invasive species. So it's worth for future consideration. And just to sum up again, for host species in stumps ground, we saw no stumps, no red maple and sugar maple coming back. And there was great variation with the invasive species, and I think it's worth doing future investigations that could be chalked up more to seed bank, or how many trees were removed, what type of gaps were created, and so forth. And again, while that Ohio data is preliminary, I think it's worth considering when you see the vast differences between those proportions of invasive species, particularly for areas that might have larger gaps and so forth, as I said before. The next step for this research is to address the question of, will this be true over time? So here is Worcester, and I will be taking this county along with Cheshire County, New Hampshire, where Keene is located, and using a Landis model, which is a spatially explicit forest landscape model. It's a mouthful. And with that model, I'll be able to take my field results from Worcester, FIA data, which Jordan spoke about, from Worcester and Keene, and integrate climate and management scenarios to scale up and see what will these areas look like over time under Asian longhorn beetle management. So they'll be at full host management. We have plans to do some variations in management, like less cutting, more cutting, and so forth. And the reason we chose Keene was originally it was an area of concern, being so close to Worcester, and there are so many host species there and so forth, so it's kind of like a tinderbox. And with that, I'd like to thank the many people who both walked me physically through the woods and then metaphorically through this data and this issue, as well as wonderful funders, lab mates, and my field techs, Jack and Tom.
What keeps the beetle in check in its native place?
In like China and Japan. So it's still considered a pest in the sense that it can kill maples over time, but there's less quantity of them. There's also a lot of testing for
Less quantity of maples or less quantity?
less maples.
Okay.
There's also some testing now, people looking into biocontrol by visiting China and seeing like what attacks ALB and so forth, as well as some herbicide and fungicide, I believe, treatments that are occurring both in China and upstate New York, actually, of being like, can we prevent an infestation by treating particularly maple trees before and so forth. Yes. Yes?
Can you compare your results to other eradications, not just of alb? I think you should start calling it alb,
Alb.
by the way. But other eradications and how communities have bounced back after other invasive species.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. I guess my initial thought is ALB is such a slow spreader, like people call it very lazy compared to EAB, which spreads much quickly that your management is like just trying to keep up. And ALB management is more like a preventative treatment in some cases, like we found it in this corner of Worcester, but with a buffer and so forth. But I think it could be interesting with perhaps like a Landis model, because people are modeling EAB, so you could take a forest in Mass or Vermont, somewhere similar, and say, okay, this is what this forest will look like in 100 years if we treat for EAB, and then I could compare my data. I think that would be kind of interesting, and especially like risk-wise, what could happen.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that a lot of timber is not checked for invasive species. Like, what are the current like regulations for checking?
I don't know specifically on timber. What I meant to more say is when things are shipped in with like wood packing materials or on pallets.
Yeah, you probably said that. I
Yeah.
just said it,
Oh, no
passed it
worries.
wrong.
I was just at an Asian Longhorned Beetle meeting last week, and that was part of the issue. And I think part of it is just policy catching up with science, and also that would be so much training to train everyone on. That's how so many invasive species come in. Though one could argue that would be really worth it, especially. It's kind of what makes ALB really interesting is when you look at the places it's come into, it almost feels random because it's shipping, you know, and it could come into Keene, it could come into Vermont, and areas that really value their trees. So but I wish I knew more about that behind the scenes. You know?
Yeah, but it's mostly in shipping containers and wood.
Yeah, and like on pallets, and some materials are like shredded wood stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
In Canada, is there extensive? I mean,
It was found in Toronto in the early, I think like 1992 or something, and it has been eradicated, but I know there is still a concern that it could come into other areas, and obviously Canada values their maple equally, and does not want our insects to spread to them as well. But it is like a cool kind of cross-cultural connection between managers. Kenna?
What's the like longevity of this herbicide? Like how often does you spray it preventatively, and how often do you need to like reapply it?
It's a great question. So it is sprayed upon treatment. So cut the tree down, and then within say you're in that site for 2 weeks, it'll be sprayed. Because from these results, we're seeing a lot of host species returning, and a majority of them being stump sprouts. Managers are wondering, like, should we go back in and spray them? Should we go back in and cut them, and so forth? But as of now, it's just after cutting.
All right. Thanks,
Great.
Olivia.